Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we begin a brief series of episodes talking about our Native Americans. And you know, this is a difficult thing to analyze and present for this area because many people anticipate and believe that we were just overrun with Native Americans at one time, but actually it's very difficult to identify who, what, why, where, when, and how the various tribes related to this immediate area. Turning the story all the way back to Columbian times, we have to remember where the term comes from. Because when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he believed that he had arrived in India. And it was Columbus who gave the title of the natives there, Indians. And of course, it was applied and it stuck. And of course, when we talk about the story of Pensacola, we go back, of course, to 1559, or even a little bit before that, and look at what the first explorers coming to this area saw and found. The first one we want to identify, of course, is Cabeza de Vaca. He arrived here in his very definite, long walk after the end of the de Narvaez expedition. He passed through northwest Florida, crossed the bay, and his little tribe of 20 or 25 men were all but starving to death, and they were greeted on the west side of the bay by a group of Native Americans. And these were folks, they were not residents here, they were here literally on vacation. And these people befriended Cabeza de Vaca and his people, fed them, and there were some of the young men that actually wanted to stay, but the Spanish pressed on. And Cabeza de Vaca did a good job of identifying the fact that there were friendly natives here. The second group, of course, that we come upon really weren't here at all, but they would have an effect on Pensacola. And these are of the Indians, the Native Americans, whom Hernando de Soto encountered as his expedition marched to the west across what we now call Alabama. Of course, de Soto was looking for a wealthy, gold-laden Indian civilization. He never found one, but he did find the relatively large civilization centered at what was called then Coosa. And the Coosa Indians, the headquarters there was roughly where Albertville, Alabama is today. And the Coosa Indians were friendly. They took good care of De Soto, and he made his people, or his survivors rather, made careful note of that. So that you put together the Cabeza de Vaca incident, and then you look at the De Soto incident, and people said, okay, there are Native Americans here, and they appear to be friendly, and we can count on them when we finally do put a settlement, a colonial effort here on the Gulf. And of course, that began with the story of De Luna. Now, De Luna knew that Coosa was about 200 miles to the north here, almost directly north. He also knew that the Coosa tribe had some satellite villages. And the story that had been brought back by the De Soto people was that there was one such satellite on a large river to the west of what we call Pensacola, about maybe 50 to 60 miles to the north. And that was basically all that they knew. So when the De Luna expedition took place, and of course they suffered almost immediately the terrible hurricane that cost them all their supplies, one of the first things they looked to do was to find that little satellite village up the what of course became up the Alabama River, and this is what we later called Nanacapana. And this is a part, of course, of the De Luna story. That village had a little bit of food. It served the De Luna people for a while. Meanwhile, once they were there, De Luna dispatched his cavalry. They all moved west. By great good luck, of course, they found the capital of Coosa and made friends with them there. Unfortunately, the coupling together of the total of the De Luna expedition and the Coosans never did take place. Well, we pass forward another considerable period of time. Now, following the De Luna expedition, of course, was the founding of St. Augustine in 1565. And from the work there, the fathers, the Catholic fathers there, began the work that they were challenged to do, and they began to put out what they called missions. And one of these was some distance to the west of St. Augustine, and they called this the Tallahassee mission area, and they put together a settlement there of a considerable number of Native Americans. And some of these people, of course, would fit into our story in a different way, because some years later, when they were accosted, I guess is the right word here, by British settlers in the Carolinas who literally attempted to enslave these people. Many of the Tallasies moved west, and only recently in the north of the Pensacola area, archaeologists from the university have found the remnants of a settlement that may have been begun here in the middle 1700s by remnants of the Tallahassee period. Well, now we move to the time when Pensacola gets its second settlement. And this, of course, is the Areola settlement, which came here in 1698. And they had counted on having the presence here of some Native Americans to help them, that they could employ as gardeners or to work with them. That did not happen because there were precious few such settlers here. About the same time, the French, of course, began their settlements at Mobile and Biloxi, and they did encounter a number of Native American groups there. One of them that they called the Chicabos, and we don't know much about the Chicabo, but there was a sort of an adjunct to that tribe, which some people called the Pensacolas. Now, I wish I could tell you that we know a whole lot about the Pensacolas and that they were a large tribe, and many of them had residence here in right in where our city is today, or our community is. But that is not true. But we know very little about the ones that the French encountered. But we do know that the Chicabos and perhaps the Pensacolas became friendly to the French, and they worked together, and later on, along with some of the Creek tribe, which were located nearby, would be part of the French army, which attacked and successfully defeated the Spanish in battles here in the early part of the 1700s. Well, as we move forward, we come into the period now where two specific events take place which do have a lot to do with our Indian friends. Number one came in the early days of the British period. And this was when the British sent here an Indian trader, a man who with great experience in the trade of British goods for furs and skins, sent him here from the Carolinas, and John Stewart arrived here and began what we today would call the Indian trade. It was very successful all through the Spanish period, or the British period, and of course this involved Indian tribes that were considerably to the north. And by that time, we were able to identify the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws. All of these people were willing to come south and trade the skins and furs that they had collected for British manufactured goods. And this continued through the British period. And then, of course, it continued further on when the Spanish returned here in the early part of the 1780s, when the Panton and Leslie trading post became the factor that did all of this work. And of course, this moved on very, very nicely, and throughout the period from, as I say, from 1764 until 1781 with the British, and then from 1784 forward with Panton and Leslie and the Forbes Company and the Innerarity Group. All of this was a very successful part of life here for the traders, and of course that was basically the economy. Now, these people got along well, and we have to take a little bit of a look at how far they would have come. The people, many of these tribal units that we're talking about would venture far down to Pensacola from as far north as what we today call Tennessee. These people came usually in October, late September and October. They would have the full collection of a year's work. They would come in here and they would have an encampment here on the western side of the city. And of course, Panton and Leslie or the British John Stewart would have their collection of British goods, and the trading went back and forth. Some say that as many as 1,000 people would have come here at one time. Now, this was a very successful arrangement on both sides, and they got along beautifully together. We have I can find practically no incidents where people said, well, this didn't work well because one person was cheated, another wasn't unhappy, or that there was excess use of alcohol or something like that. That just wasn't part of the story at all. They got along very well. Well, we come to the point now in 1783, when a treaty was signed, of course, which created the United States of America, established what the territory of the new country was going to be as it divided from Great Britain, and of course the fact that there was going to be a Spanish segment down here that was owned, which we, of course, at that time would still call Spanish Florida. That was here, and one of the important parts of that treaty was in establishing a free land for the Native Americans north of the Spanish Florida. And there were specific strips, east and west, along this area, all the way to the Mississippi River, which were specifically detailed to be the territories of those tribes, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and so on. They were there, and this was supposed to be their land. And it started out just fine, but then almost within just a few years, American citizens out of Georgia began to infringe on that territory. They moved west, and we begin to see the beginning of conflict between Americans and the Indians. Now, this is the same time. This is the era now of the great Alexander McGillivray story. McGillivray, for a period of almost a decade, was the chief of the Creek Nation. It was McGillivray who was the friend of Panton and Leslie, who helped put the trade together and make it so successful. McGillivray, of course, was trying hard to keep the Georgians out of the Indian territory, and it was McGillivray, of course, who appealed to General Washington, who had now become the President of the United States, for help. And it was Washington, of course, that sided with McGillivray, said, yes, absolutely, you are correct. Our people from Georgia are violating the treaty, and did their best, but unfortunately that didn't work well either. So year by year, we begin to see more and more pressure coming from the east onto the Indians in the area that was given to them by treaty. This was further compounded in 1803 when the United States and France ended a treaty in which the United States purchased what we today call the Louisiana area. This was, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. And one thing that historically stands out in this as well, there are some people, some historians who believe that when all of the signing was done, that President Jefferson, who was, of course, the instrument for the American purchase here, had in his mind that a significant part of the land to the west of the Mississippi, which had been acquired by the United States, would now become forever the land of these Indian tribes, so that the tribes which were in the area above Florida and below Tennessee would be moved, but into an area which would be very, very favorable land, and it would be theirs. And by treaty, the United States would move into a new agreement with the Indians themselves. Why nothing happened on that, I cannot tell you. But the several historians, several biographers of Jefferson believe that was in his mind, but unfortunately for the Indians, it did not happen. Okay, we move now into the period about the year 1810. And this is when we begin to see the citizens who have moved in from Georgia, and now some also from the Carolinas, begin to establish not only their own personal farms in what was legally Indian territory. They began to move even more into settlement. And if we look at the area around Brewton, Alabama, this was where the elements that we see today were such places as Mason and Bellevue and Sparta. And this, of course, is where the Army would shortly establish Fort Crawford as a defense point. These were settlements of people who pretty technically were working outside of the treaty arrangements, but they kept on anyway. And of course, this obviously was going to create more and more conflict with the Indians. Efforts were made to provide provision for honest dealing, but basically, step by step, things were going badly. So badly so that by the time we get to about the year 1812, a great chief of the northern tribe, a chief named Tecumseh, literally came south and tried to organize a confederation of the Cherokees, Creeks, and the others into a confederation that would stand in defense against the loss of their territories. He tried to put this all together, but for the sake of the Indians, it did not work. Some of the tribes were a little bit afraid of this, and so they backed off. So if we look at the year 1812, 1813, the situation is beginning to broil. We see more and more conflict coming between the Indians of the Southeast and the Americans. And of course, meanwhile, the Spanish here in Florida, they are frightened to death that they are going to be mixed up in a war that they did not want. And that's the way things stood as the War of 1812 began.